It's times like this when the power and the value of the STEM learning ecosystem's community of practice become really visible. Presented by STEM at Home, an initiative launched by the STEM Learning Ecosystem Community of Practice, STEM Community Conversations is a series of conversations for teachers, school officials, community leaders, and the many others impacted by school closures and virtual learning. Embracing the ecosystem way, these gatherings will provide a space and time for leaders to share common challenges, ideas, and resources. Conversations will revolve around successful models and new ideas to support STEM learning experiences during and beyond this time of social distancing. Thank you for joining us today for Connecting the Unconnected, Strategies for Ecosystems, brought to you by Spark 101. Spark 101 fills the communication gap between students and employers around the world. And we're being joined today by Vinton Cerf and other leading connectivity experts who will meet in a moment to have a practical discussion about how to get millions of students living in homes with no broadband access online. This is a really critical conversation, and we need you to be involved. So as our panel discusses not only this need, but the things that you can do to help address the problem, be sure to post questions in the chat. We'll be pulling some of those questions into the conversation, and with some luck, we'll be asking some of you to ask your questions live on air as well. So without further ado, Vinton Cerf has served as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist, can't even talk, for Google since October 2005. In this role, he is responsible for identifying new enabling technologies to support the development of advanced internet-based products and services from Google. He's also an active public face for Google in the internet world. Widely known as one of the fathers of the internet, Cerf is the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocol and the architecture of the internet. For this work, Cerf and his colleague, Robert Kahn, have received the Turing Award, also known as the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, the National Medal of Technology from President Bill Clinton, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George W. Bush, the highest civilian award given by the United States to its citizens. So Vint, before we introduce everybody else, I'm hoping that you can share a little bit with us about what you're working on now, your thoughts, and what we should be thinking about as we're all addressing this really critical need.
Well, thanks so much, Jeremy. I appreciate that introduction. The thing I'd like to draw everyone's attention to is that while STEM is driving a lot of what we are concerned about, getting more people to think in scientific and technical terms, to think critically about what they see and hear, which is sort of a fundamental notion of the scientific method, but it applies to virtually everything, including misinformation and disinformation, which we experience every day now, unfortunately, in the World Wide Web. So the discussion we're having today is broader than just STEM. In fact, as we see the schools faced with social distancing, they're having to put all of their teaching components online in some fashion. And so the access to the internet is vital to responding to the current STEM policies, which involve the school closings and social distancing, among other things. So the topic that we're addressing today is actually extremely broad. Not only does it have to speak to direct access to the internet at speeds that are sufficient to do things like we're doing right this moment, but it also gets to the economics of access, and it gets to the problem of access where there isn't any, or there isn't sufficient quantities of it. So in the rural parts of America, we see a great deal of variation in access to internet, including none. I'm particularly concerned about access for Native American populations, and where the reservations tend to be quite isolated from the communications point of view, but that problem shows up not only in other parts of rural America, but also in inner cities, where the facilities may be present, but the costs are too high. So we have a number of issues here to deal with, which are technical and economic, but they are also very much related to content and the ability to deliver content to everyone who needs it. So this should be a discussion about not only getting people connected, but getting them connected in a way which is, I would say, constructive and useful, and opens opportunities for creative ways of using these technologies. So let me stop there, because I have other colleagues, as you will introduce, who are also equally and very much involved in STEM-related problems, and also in access to the internet. So let's let the discussion begin.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Let's definitely introduce them. I think that I'd like everybody to make sure that we're thinking about what Vint just mentioned, that it's not just about turning on a switch, right? It's not about flipping a switch and giving access to people, which is a critical barrier on its own. It's also about how are we supporting the usage of that access, and making sure that everyone has the same ability to connect with both education and economic opportunities. So that's a good place, I think, for us to introduce the rest of our panel. We have some really, really incredible panelists here who are going to engage in this conversation and help us all think about ways that we can be shifting both policy and our own internal thinking. And I'd like to start with Samantha Schartman-Cycyk. Samantha is the executive director of the Marconi Society. She has deep experience in digital inclusion, is founder and CEO of Connected Insights, and is the research director of the Connect Your Community Institute. Samantha has worked with various populations, from the elderly to students, to extend the benefits of connectivity to them in a way that's meaningful for their lives, and to increase awareness for funding and funding for digital inclusivity. Samantha, could you tell us a little bit about the work that the Marconi Marconi Society is doing to think about fostering innovative thinking, and how is that impacted by the situation right now?
Thank you, Jeremy, and hi, everyone. So the Marconi Society is really thinking about this in the way of how do we lay the groundwork for addressing this long term. You know, the current epidemic is really shining a light on digital inclusion, and while there's a strong emphasis right now on addressing these divides now, many, if not most, of the problems that we're being made aware of have already been there and are going to be there. It will continue to be present.
I think we just temporarily lost Samantha's. Oh, there she is. Samantha, I think we lost you for a sec. Samantha, I'm gonna give you an opportunity to check your microphone, maybe drop out and back in to see if we have a connection issue. And while you're doing that, I'd like to introduce David Bray. Dr. David Bray has served in a variety of leadership roles in turbulent environments, including bioterrorism preparedness and response from 2000 to 2005, time on the ground in Afghanistan 2009, serving as a nonpartisan executive director from National Commission on R&D, and providing leadership as nonpartisan federal agency senior executive. It's a lot of nonpartisans. He accepted a leadership role in 2019 to incubate a new global center with the Atlantic Council, and also provide strategy to both boards and startups, espousing human-centric principles to technology-enabled decision-making in complex environments. He's named a senior fellow at the Institute for Human Machine Cognition, and Business Insider named him one of the top 24 Americans who are changing the world under 40, which is pretty incredible. And he was named a young global leader by the World Economic Forum as well. So David, as we're thinking about you know, the current situation and this this issue of social distancing and trying to work in these really distributed environments, I'm wondering what the implications are in your mind for reaching students and reaching community members.
Yes, so first, honored to be here, and I think as Vint was talking about, and it's accelerated trends that we're pushing for distributed approaches for education. I think education is never going to look the same as a result of COVID-19. I think it is going to result in potentially more homeschooling or course curriculum that's delivered, and then you can make a choice between whether you do it completely 100% in your home with your children, or you take them to both have social interaction with others, but also the ability to do homeschooling as well. So I think universities, I think schools for elementary, for middle, it's going to change how it works. It's going to be an interesting space for curriculum designers to think about how we do that combination of the in-person to maximize the in-person when students do get together with a teacher or an instructor, as well as to maximize their learning when they're in a more distributed fashion. And then also, we've been really looking for what is that killer application for extended reality, the idea of convergence of augmented reality and virtual reality, which of course does require broadband access to make it happen, which right now not everyone in the country does have, not to mention around the world. And so if anything, COVID-19 may shine the light on the fact that we do have parts of the United States, parts of the world, we've gotten 50% of the planet connected, but we still have a responsibility to everybody else that doesn't have broadband to find a way that's affordable to them The last thing I'll say is spent about 3 years working with Vint with the People-Centered Internet Coalition as well before my current role. And I think that's a wonderful example of how you get Native Americans to have a locus of choice and control about making sure they're connected. One of the things that they did before I moved on to the Atlantic Council was they did get one of the most remote tribes in the continental United States connected at the base of Grand Canyon that was actually led by the tribe. And as Vint was mentioning, it's not just about getting the connectivity through broadband, it's then how does that change education? How does that change the future of work? How does that change healthcare? And how they choose to have it impact how they work together as a society.
Perfect. That's great. And I think it'll be really valuable insights as we get into this conversation. Samantha, I think you're back with us now. I want to try that again. Hopefully we can hear you this time.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. We'll give it a shot. Sorry about that before, guys. What I was basically saying is that I think that there's an emphasis right now on addressing this issue, but ultimately what is happening is that we are becoming more aware of a problem that has existed for quite a long time. For those of us who have worked in and around the digital inclusion space for a long time, we have been jumping up and down saying that we need to get more people connected, that there are multiple divides. It's not just access, it is cost, it is accessibility, it is access to hardware as well as the actual connection. So there's a number of different ways that people have to overcome barriers. The Marconi Society has been focused a little bit on a overarching policy topic, which is how do we use our federal structure to subsidize the right places where access needs to be built. So many of us are familiar with the FCC 477 data and understand that data set is highly flawed in that it is self-reported by telcos. This is the mechanism by which a lot of predominantly rural, but also other infrastructure is allocated at the federal level. So just about a month ago, we had $20 billion of infrastructure spending that was allocated by the FCC. We hear this, it is supposed to be allocated based on this 477 data that basically misses a big, large chunks of those that are in need. The way it's calculated, and Bill can attest to this as well, because I know NTIA has done a lot of looking at this as well, is that if one household within a census block can be shown as being served by an ISP, they consider the entire block served. And so what that does is that leaves a bunch of holes all over the place, all over the national broadband map. So what the Marconi Society is doing is we are partnering with an organization called MLab, also known as Measurement Lab, and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, and a few others to create a new platform to use broadband speed test data along with some user-generated information. So asking people to supply some location information that is more granular than the ISP level, which is typically what you get from a broadband speed test. So by pairing these two data sets together, we should be able to get a comparable data set at the same granularity as the FCC broadband map, which is at the census block level. So by giving another alternate version of data, which will comment on availability and the quality of service that is user generated, not self-reported by a provider, our hope is that we can start to use this as an alternative for local infrastructure building initiatives, local government initiatives who are looking to do infrastructure planning, to use that to lobby for federal broadband funding.
I think we're going to get into some good conversations in a little bit about what the people on this call can do to help push that type of work forward. Yes. Next up, we have Dr. Lin Wells. Dr. Wells focuses on the links between policy, technology, and decision-making, especially in cyber resilience and cybersecurity, smart cities and community resilience, disaster mitigation and response, and space-related issues. He's particularly interested in STEM education, as well as the inclusion of art and design, STEAM, He has extensive civilian government leadership experience in national security affairs, including service as U.S. Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Networks and Information Integration and Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. 2010-2014, he led the Center for Technology and National Security Policy, a research center at the U.S. National Defense University. He is executive advisor to the new Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities at George Mason University and visiting distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at NDU. He's also a career naval officer. In 2014, he completed 51 years with the Department of Defense. Lin, so I'm curious, what of your work in the past, I'm thinking in particular about the community resilience components. So I don't think anything really has set us up to be totally successful in what's happening now, because it's very new and novel, at least since the Spanish flu. But what lessons do we have from the work that you have done in community resilience that are going to help us kind of bounce back from this and come back both quickly and strong?
So I think a couple things. First of it's never just technology. It's always some combination of people and organizations and processes and technology together. And this is kind of the point that both Vint and Samantha made about once you get the connectivity, you still have to get the pedagogy, and you still have to get the people have computers in their homes and so on and so forth. So you have to think in terms of those integrated pieces. The second is anytime you try to solve a complex problem, some call a wicked problem, it's always the intersection of several other problems. And so once you begin to solve it, you change it, which means that the solution is almost always going to be iterative rather than linear. And the important part there is you have to document the going-in assumptions on which you base your decision. Okay, we expect to have this many people connected by such and such time. We expect to have this kind of outcome. And then you schedule reviews. And so, and when the review comes up, and if your plan is proceeding according to your assumptions, you go on. If it's not, you change it. And that's a leadership challenge, both up and down the line, in that you have to get with your bosses at the beginning and say, when I have this review, if the data suggests it's better to change course, that's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. And similarly, you have to go with your team and say, all right, we've chosen course of action 1, and I expect, I hope for full support. But if we come to the point where we change, again, I need to move out in the new approach because that's based on a data-driven solution. So some of those things. The last point I'd like to make is that you mentioned bounce back. And we try to think of resilience as not bouncing back, but bouncing forward better. How do you wind up stronger after the stresses and shocks than you were when you went in? And there are typically 4 phases to a disruption. How do you anticipate? How do you withstand? How do you recover? And then how do you adapt and grow? And that adapt and grow is a really critical piece, because the situation you're going to be at the end is very likely not going to be where you were when you started off.
Absolutely. And finally, we have Bill Callahan. Bill is Research and Policy Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, the National Coalition of Community Digital Inclusion Advocates and Practitioners. Callahan has been a leader in local, statewide, and national efforts to increase digital access and literacy among disadvantaged Americans since 1996. From 2010 to 13, Callahan directed One Community's Connect Your Community project, one of the largest sustainable broadband adoption initiatives funded by the U.S. Commerce Department's Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, which provided training and/or home broadband assistance to more than 30,000 unconnected residents of Cleveland, Detroit, and 6 other communities. Bill, I've got this question for you. I'm from Cleveland as well. I know the critical work that the One Community did here. I know when you start an initiative like that, there are probably certain things that you know are going to be difficult and certain things that are kind of easy. But I'm curious about the things that, as you're thinking about connecting, that you thought initially when this all started was going to be easy. There were going to be quick checklist items, and they ended up turning into big obstacles that you really had to overcome before you could make big movements. So what are the things that, as people are starting to spread out, starting to address this issue, that they might not be thinking are going to be big problems and are becoming one? Bill? I think you were muted there, Bill. There you go. Oh,
It's
there you are.
Yes, it's the self-mute function. Let me say a couple of words about what National Digital Inclusion Alliance is, because it's relevant to your question. As Jeremy said, we represent organizations around the country that are actually engaged in digital inclusion work. And what that means in practice is about 400 affiliated organizations in 44 states, which include everything from city governments and housing authorities to library systems and to state broadband offices, but most particularly to community-based organizations that either train people to use broadband or help them get cheap computers through refurbishing to be able to use it, or provide support, or in many cases, spend their time trying to figure out how to find or create a cheap, that's affordable is the preferred word, solution to enable people with very limited means to have a sustainable broadband connection. Those elements that I just went through are what NDIA refers to as the four legs of the digital inclusion stool, as affordable equipment, affordable connectivity, some basic skills to use it, and then an ongoing structure of community support, which I think if people on the call think about their own experience, probably as largely middle-class adopters sometime in the last 20 or 25 years or longer, you'll see that you had all those things, right? And in particular, you almost certainly had a web of professional or community or family support that helped you when you got on the learning curve to stay on the learning curve and to learn from it. So that's really the model that NDIA pursues, and it's not something we invented brilliantly. It's something that is developed out of a long period of practical hands-on community work by a lot of people. And my personal journey in this started in 1996, working for a community development organization on the west side of Cleveland. A lot of other people's date back somewhere between a quarter or a half or 3/4 that long. People have started, but everybody has had that experience of actually getting up and going to work in the morning and figuring out what it's going to take to get people connected today. So when we started the project that you were referring to, Jeremy, the premise of the project was we wanted to go out and find people who were doing that work on a hands-on daily basis and throw some money at them. It was as simple as that. There's going to be federal money available. What would happen if you made it possible to hire enough people to actually do this work in a serious, sustained way? But the premise was that we kind of knew where the pain points were. The problem was, in some ways, you have to buy your way past those pain points. The fact is, the biggest pain point remains cost. There's no question about that. The digital inclusion on a community level is human work, right? People are starting in a situation where they don't have the technology to rely on, and they need human beings that they can trust and relate to help them learn it.
Sure.
So it's very human work, it's very labor intensive, but lots of people have figured out how to do it effectively. So, and I would say to people in school systems and other organizations that are confronting this for the first time, lots of people have been there before you. You should go find some of those people in your community, because it's not a mystery how this is done. But you will always run into the problem that at some point people have to be able to sustain their own connection to the internet, and that in most communities in the country, in the United States of America, the ticket of entry is somewhere between $50 and $70 a month, whether you're getting it from the cable company or you're getting from the telco company. And for many people, that is not an affordable price. And the one statistic I want to use initially is this one. When you look at the census, the most recent census data, what it will tell you is that there were about 18 million households in 2018 that didn't have any kind of broadband connection at all, right? Not a data plan, nothing. 4 million of them lived in rural areas.
So I guess I think that brings us to this, right? There's and I think that this goes right along with what you're saying, Bill. There's a recent New York Times article by Dana Goldstein and others that says in high poverty areas, 50% of students don't have reliable internet access, and that's very, very typical. 50% of students not having access. That same article, by the way, says that Cleveland, where I am and where you were, as many as 60% do not. So, Vint, can you give us a little bit of context here before we jump pretty soon into what folks can do? Why does this divide exist in the first place?
Well, the divide exists partly for the reasons that Bill mentioned, and that's cost. And the cost, there are two flavors. One is the cost to the consumers. The other one is the cost to the providers. It's a non-trivial exercise to bring broadband facilities. And we learned this. The Google Fiber project jumped in and brought gigabit per second services at what were thought to be affordable, despite Bill's comment. It was about $70 a month, but for a gigabit per second, bi-directional sounded like a pretty good deal. But again, if you don't have the money, you can't afford it. Doesn't matter how good the deal is. But we very quickly discovered that digging up the streets and pulling fiber was a very expensive proposition. And so we began exploring other alternatives, which is to take existing fiber and extend it using radio links, for example, or even laser links. But in the end, finding a way to make it sustainable and affordable is a very big challenge. But I'd like to also draw your attention to a couple of other things which are factors in here. One of them is access to communications capacity at all. And among the things that are offered by the FCC is the educational broadband spectrum, otherwise called ABS. That spectrum is in the 2.5 gigahertz range. And in terms of what could you do, and as an example, the Native American tribes, because of their status as international or not, the national states, have the ability to apply to get access to that spectrum for free in the areas that they are responsible for in the Native American reservations. It's free, but they have to apply. And if they don't know about it or don't know how to apply or don't know where to apply, they may actually lose access to that spectrum because by August 3rd, the FCC plans to auction off spectrum to any party who's interested if you did not apply for authority to use that spectrum. So there's a strong activity going on in a number of places, the People-Centered Internet, the Marconi Society, and elsewhere, to help the Native American tribes sign up for that spectrum. But there's a short timeline for getting access, after which there's a couple of years when you can decide what to do with it. That's an example of something that the Native American tribes can do. I wanted to bring up two other things. One of them is that municipal networks or consortia, which have been a popular way to respond to the fact that some of the telcos and incumbent ISPs have not extended their networks out into the rural parts of the country. One response to that is to build municipal networks and to try to solve the problem that way. The trouble is that some of the incumbents have managed to get laws passed that say that if a municipality wants to build its own network, that it's competing with the private sector, and there's something evil about that. I'm very disappointed with that tactic. But it's a serious problem, and it's one which your listeners need to be aware of and may, in fact, need to lobby against so as to allow municipalities to build their own systems if they can't get any help from the incumbents. So that's the second thing. The third thing I wanted to reinforce is the importance of digital literacy. And that's not only understanding how does it work, but also what the hazards are associated with being online. And I think this is a very, very important part of the STEM education theme. It's not just about getting access to STEM topics and the like, but it's about understanding how to operate safely and usefully in an online environment.
Yeah, I know that a coalition led by, I think, ISTE of Google and Facebook and Apple and all sorts of folks, Common Sense is working on this new DigCit Commit initiative, which is specifically about that. It's that, we, I think, have a tendency to sort of assume that our kids are, that term digital natives, which I hate, because it sets up this assumption that they don't need to learn anything. I think finally schools and organizations are really dipping in together to address that. So there's some interesting questions coming up. I'd like to, in a second, unmute Joanne Coggan and have her ask her question about kind of hesitancy. But while she's getting ready for that, somebody else asked, Betsy Stefani was asking specifically about the Native American populations. You were mentioning that there's, this access that's available to them, but they've got to apply for it. So I'm wondering, maybe Samantha, how do we get these communities who may not have trust to feel both empowered and that it is the right thing to do to apply for this access? How do we gain that trust so that we can move this conversation forward?
So it sounds like, Jeremy, you kind of said two almost separate things, although they do intersect. One is how do you gain trust? And the other one is how do you apply for access? So if you're talking about first gaining trust on the individual, the residential level, so the end users, that is something where I think it's so important for local stakeholders to work with community organizations. These are the places that people go for help with housing, with food assistance, with other things. They're trusted, leaders in communities. Mm-hmm. So if you are a local government stakeholder or a state representative looking to connect with federal programs to create broadband or, infrastructure investment and things, I think you need to do that in conjunction with your community partners, because that's the link to the people that ultimately are going to need to adopt the technology and to make the whole thing work. Right? So, the federal government or state representatives and local government leaders can build a network. They can build, means of access, but unless there's the adoption piece, there's no point. And so as far as building trust there, I would say start with local community stakeholders. As far as gaining access and applying, I think that's also a community organizing problem that we need to figure out. First of all, what is the information? What data is necessary in order to make use of that? The recent Broadband Data Act did allow an opening for local stakeholders to kind of petition the 477 data, which is sort of holding the purse strings on the FCC infrastructure money. But so there might be a way to use local resources and community organizing to kind of create a data set that can combat that.
But I think a lot of this seems to come down to, right, that their national initiatives aren't going to alone solve this issue. That we have to really be thinking about what individual communities are doing for that support. And with a really, I think, interesting question from that perspective, one of our partners, Joanne Coggan, asked, I think, a question that I hadn't thought about in the chat. Joanne?
Hi, yeah, and my question might be more relevant to a separate conversation, but I'm in Vancouver, Canada, and, I also wonder how many assumptions we're making here as well. So we reached out to many of the Indigenous communities around Canada that don't have any connectivity, and other remote and rural communities as well. And what we heard back from some of them is they don't actually want connectivity. So one of the questions I have is, how do we reach those who actually don't want to be connected? With many of the Indigenous communities here in British Columbia, it's not an integral part of their ways of knowing and learning and understanding. So yeah, I'm trying to find ways to reach those who actually don't want to be connected. Yes, in some cases it may have to do with trust. Yes, in some cases it may have to do with affordability, but they don't want to be connected.
All right, thank you, Joanne. Vint, and then I think David was trying to say something as well.
Just the short answer to this, of course, is that they may have good reason not to want to be connected or for cost reasons and so on, and we can overcome that by driving cost out. But they may also not want to be connected because they read all these horrible things that happen online and they feel unsafe. And that is back to digital literacy. But it's also about getting the providers of these services to pay increasing amounts of attention to safety and security in the online environment.
David?
Yeah, to amplify what Vint said. So from our own experiences when we were working with the People-Centered Internet Coalition, it really has to be someone who's a member of that existing community going to the community and saying this is necessary. I don't think you can convince them. And what we found oftentimes, it was when a member of a Native American community went to college, and then when they came back to their tribe, because usually college is when they got exposed to the internet, that they actually convinced the tribe that this was useful. And I think it's worth expanding this beyond just Native American, but also thinking about rural communities in general. It's got to be someone that goes back to the community and makes a case that this is needed, not only for education, because while that's very important, I hate to say it, political appointees probably respond more to the economic argument. And so what you need is someone that goes back and says, this is both important about education for our region, but this is also important for the economy of our region. And as Vint mentioned, at least in the United States, as of like 2016, there was at least 37 states that had made it against the law for you to actually do municipal broadband. And that was probably for interesting purposes that were not necessarily in the best interest of the localities. And so I raise that because the way you'll really drive change is when you find a member of the community that says, this is both about education and STEM, however, this is also about driving our education and makes that compelling case. The last thing that I would also just say that we should start thinking about is this additional, where we've done 50% of the internet so far, do we need to start looking to other ways of doing this? And Vint mentioned a little bit how Google experimented with laser. There's also the idea of tethered drones. Do we need to start shifting away from terrestrial solutions to something that's either provided either through low Earth orbit, recognizing there may be lag effects, or things that are provided that sort of is provided for large groups of people, either through an aerial means or something like that. Recognize that still has to connect to eventually to a fiber backhaul. But maybe the other challenge we're seeing aside from the cost is, just for rural areas, it's a lot harder to roll out what was conventionally done for the internet for urban areas, maybe needs a different type of way of actually providing it that requires different localities to mobilize to make it happen.
Jeremy,
Yeah, Bill.
just to go back to the question we were talking about a second ago, there's a long traditional argument in people who do survey research on the subject of adoption of broadband, because there's always a very large number of people who basically say, I don't have broadband at home because I don't want it. And there's a school of thought that says, well, that just proves that it isn't that big a deal for a lot of people and we should not worry about the adoption rate. Those of us who do this work have always kind of said, well, yeah, if you asked 3 more questions, you might find out why they're saying that. And it might have something to do with cost or fear, legitimate fear, well-grounded fear, or other things. But it is nonetheless clearly true that people have mixed motives in this respect. But the other thing that I think it's really important to remember is we all tend to think of this as, well, this train is moving and this is just a question of how we get everybody to get on board, right? And the reality is that people are always being told, in a sense, if you don't get on board, you can't have that basic thing that you could have yesterday, right? If you don't get on board with this, you can't have that job sweeping floors that you used to have yesterday. And in this particular context, if you don't get on board, you know, guess what? We're all closing school for 4 weeks, and you're not going to have a connection to the school if you don't get on board. There are people who can't apply for unemployment in the current situation because states have moved their entire unemployment application systems to online, fairly complicated online systems, and they don't have the ability to do that. A lot of this digital divide stuff is not something that is a reflection of people's reluctance to join, but the fact that we have moved the goalposts on them to the point where they have, and in this case, COVID-19 has moved the goalposts on them to create a situation where people are going to be in big trouble if they don't. And I think it's important as we think about this question to recognize that when you force somebody into a situation of that kind, you really have an obligation to do something to help them to deal with it. And a lot of school districts right now are confronting that for the first time, right? And a lot of other organizations are as well. That, you know, this is an imposition on people, not an invitation to people. And if you're not going to simply turn them away, you got to do something affirmative to help them. I don't think we've recognized that as a nation yet.
So I think that really brings us to where we need to be talking now for this last 20 minutes. I'm going to ask you guys a question. I'm going to give you a second to think about it while we take one last question from the audience, from Carrie McGann. Carrie, I'm going to unmute you in a second. But after we answer Carrie's question, I'd like us to really be thinking about what are the kind of specific actionable things that the people on this call, many of whom are leaders in their communities, can and should be doing to drive this work forward now and in the future. And Lynn, I'm gonna go to you first when we come back from that. But before we get to that question, Carrie's got an interesting question about who's having conversations with the ISPs that do exist right now. Carrie, you there?
I am. Hi, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. This is Carrie McGann. I'm calling in from New Jersey. I'm the superintendent in a K-12 district, and always involved with STEM. So my question is, I would like to know if anyone who is talking with our largest internet providers, such as Verizon and Comcast and Xfinity. Someone on the chat mentioned that there was an agreement in Los Angeles to provide internet access for students who are economically disadvantaged. We don't have any agreements like that out in New Jersey, and I'm wondering who, if anyone, is talking with these to try and negotiate some support for our students who are economically disadvantaged and do not have internet access.
So it's Vint. There's two things. First of all, there is this E-rate thing, which is supposed to help schools get access. That doesn't necessarily help families to get access. Google actually did something in one rural part of North Carolina. We put Wi-Fi capability on the school buses so the kids had access while they were going back and forth. And there's at least one instance where the school buses were parked in the community in order to provide Wi-Fi. It wasn't the same exactly as having it at home. With regard to Verizon, since I'm in their bailiwick as well, I would be happy to work with you to get the attention of some of the senior people there to get an answer to your question. So my email is vint, V-I-N-T, @google.com. Shoot me an email and we'll talk to one of the senior VPs at Verizon.
Well, that is not the answer that you normally get in something like this. That's pretty amazing. So Carrie, you'll have to make sure to kind of keep us posted about that. All right. So as we wrap up here, these last 17 minutes, time always goes by so fast. Lynn, you have a whole lot of experience in kind of marshaling the troops and getting things moving forward towards specific goals. What can people be doing? What do we need to work on right now?
So I'm going to come back to one of the points that David made earlier about trusted young people. We've been working a fair amount in the southern coal counties of West Virginia and trying to find ways to look at alternatives to the job markets down there. And what we find is that the critical people, the people that are trusted in those organizations tend to fall into two categories. One is young people who've left, gone off and got some kind of education and then chosen to return. And there's some really good examples in Southern West Virginia, people who've done that. And then the other are faith-based groups. And so if we're going to tap into those, I think that would be a place to start. The second is, and this comes less into the broadband than into the processes, Francis Queck, who's a professor down at Texas A&M, has been looking at STEM education in the underprivileged schools along the U.S.-Mexican border. And his point is that particularly in the 4th to 6th grade area, there's virtually no capability within the local teachers. But there's enormous capability in the undergraduate students in the engineering schools that are nearby. And so what they've done is they've taken about a 6-week course at $10 an hour and trained up the undergraduates to go into the schools under the tutelage of the existing teachers. So they're reinforcing the authority and the dignity of the teachers while conveying, enormously more STEM information than they would have been able to get just by trying to train the teachers to teach it. And so it seems to me both of those point in ways to you find some actionable things we could do is to leverage more of the young people. The last part of this is there's an organization called Teeniors, TEENIORS, where teens are actually helping older people connect to the internet, use their cell phones, that kind of thing. So I think that's a really maybe utilized resource that we could tap into. The last thing, just in terms of lessons, is I wonder what lessons we could learn out of the expansion of rural electrification in the 30s. I'm sure there were people when the TVA rolled out and things like that who said, well, I don't need electricity. And yet, eventually it got built out. So what can we learn from those experiences?
So I think what you're saying is that there's, first of all, once we don't social distance, we have to really be thinking about the community resources we have available to us that can help push these things out.
Totally.
And also the lessons that may not be directly applicable, but they're the closest models we have sometimes, right, for figuring out kind of this expansion. David, what about right now? Are there things that are in in the House and the Senate right now, or in other areas of the country where our members should be advocating and pushing and helping support kind of immediate change?
Right. I think sort of what was already said here is, if you can start creating awareness in your community can elevate it to either your representative in the Congress or your state senator. They then can carry it to the Congress, because we know there's going to be additional stimulus associated with the COVID recovery. And so if you can make the case that this is both about the education, but about the economic recovery that's going to be needed for the nation as a result of everything that happened with COVID, there's a good chance that you may actually be able to find new ways of getting funding to make this happen. Because that's what I was going to lead to. The three things I would recommend anybody do, whether it's right now or in the future, is the first thing you need to do is what Bill said, which is find experts. Because nobody's going to be an expert on all these topics, but if you can find experts in your community, that leads to step two, which is start doing op-eds, getting a voice for this, try to get the attention of either your local or your state representatives that are in office. And then finally, figure out what's motivating them. And while we are all here because we're passionate about STEM and education, they're probably motivated by education, and they're trying, but also the economy. And so if you can find a way to actually get them motivated, get the private sector motivated as well, maybe you do partner with an ISP, maybe you partner with someone that's going to be a future ISP. We talked about traditional ISPs, but I'm pretty sure Amazon, I won't speak for Google because that's Vint, but I'm pretty sure Amazon, Apple, SpaceX, they all want to be future ISPs as well. So look to who you can partner with to then be that fulcrum to try and get funding available to make it available for the nation and your locality as well.
Yeah, Vint?
Yeah, well, I was just going to react to David's comment about talking to legislators. The primary motivation legislators seem to have is to get reelected. So if there's an argument of some kind which persuades them that if they do X, that they will satisfy that desire, but also have a beneficial result with regard to STEM and general access to broadband internet, that might be a winning combination.
Yes, and actually, well, real quick, Vint could say that. I couldn't say that because I'm a nonpartisan, but he's absolutely right. President Lincoln said, "I do not like that person. I must get to know them better." To be a successful positive change agent, get to know what's driving the other person and find a way to make it a win-win for both involved.
So let me come back to the non-terrestrial possibilities. I think everybody is well aware of what SpaceX is trying to do with the Starlink, and there are some 200 or so satellites now that are already up in orbit. If that actually works, it has a lot of attraction because the low Earth orbit means that the latencies are fairly low. All the indications right now are that it's still going to be a very costly kind of service, given even with the reduced cost of reuse of boosters and everything else. So we're some distance away from LEO being a solution for rural parts of the country, and so we need to look to other things. One thing I would draw your attention to is FirstNet, which is an effort to get emergency service communications fully equipped across the country. That's an AT&T program. They won the competition to provide the FirstNet service. One thing we might want to do is persuade AT&T to make access to the towers that they have to put up for FirstNet, so that it can also be used to carry Wi-Fi or other communications capabilities into the rural parts of the country.
So this is Lynn, just to build on what Vint just said. In addition to FirstNet, the EDA, Economic Development Administration, NIST, and the FirstNet Coalition, or whatever it's called, are having an initiative that just has been kicked off on calling R2 Nets, which is Response and Resilience Networks. And it's building on FirstNet to get more kind of innovation, entrepreneurship, funding into the R2 first responder and resiliency network space. So whereas FirstNet is building on existing equipment and building out the network, R2 tries to go one step further with more innovative concepts and more community involvement and things like that.
Samantha, I saw you trying to jump in there.
Oh, well, I don't know if this is redundant to anything, but I wanted to kind of emphasize a point that I think Bill actually hit on earlier, is that as far as the people on this call and what can they do right now, there's a lot of different pieces, you know, as far as, you know, building out our infrastructure and whatnot. But ultimately, a lot of adoption comes down to a human, you know, problem. And, you know, a case management approach of understanding what each individual person's barriers are and linking them with local available opportunities to connect is really what has been a winning, you know, combination. Bill and I worked on the Connect Your Community project, and I ran all of these, you know, several survey research projects. And a lot of the people that said that they initially said that fear was a barrier, ultimately education solved that fear and got them over that barrier. That a lot of that was able to be resolved. These are things that we can all do that are low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of resources out there. The National Digital Inclusion Alliance has a lot of those things on their website, as far as, you know, contacts for EBS providers. If you haven't joined their listserv, you should. You know, so there are refurbishers, there are EBS providers that do reselling of equipment and service on the Sprint network. You can all have access to that through, you know, by reaching out, working with your housing authorities, working with local governments, working with all of these people are going to be the way to figure out how to knit together this fabric of resources to meet the individual needs. It's very much a high-touch case management approach to getting people online. And I see Bill smiling, because this is something we used to say over and over and over again. But while there's always going to be that small faction of people where that's not going to be enough, that is enough for a lot of people. Many of the people that said that cost was a barrier, after going through 30 hours of training with a high-touch case management, you know, a lot of support around them, they ended up getting a traditional ISP connection. They found the money in their extremely resource-strapped, you know, situation to make that connection after they were shown how it can benefit them personally in different areas of their life. We called that meaningful use at the time. So how we could offload other costs for them. You know, by doing their banking online, by, you know, interacting with their doctors without making, you know, appointments and copays, and all of these things end up lowering the cost of access, you know, at the individual level. But that's something that only can happen on a one-to-one, you know, basis. There's no big overarching policy that can address all of the different barriers that individuals are experiencing.
Yeah. I agree. There are, this is for you, Bill. So I saw in the chat a mention of a link for Coggan. If those of you listening aren't familiar with Coggan, they're a really incredible organization that does a lot of work, particularly in schools with CTOs and networking. But the link there was for a resource for people to, you know, type in their zip code and you know, make template letters to try to get broadband access put into the next stimulus bill. So that's one that I think everybody should definitely check out. What else is out there, Bill? What organizations are really working deeply right now in solving this problem that people can and should be supporting?
Well, so first, let me just say, because nobody has, I want to echo Sam's point that doesn't cost any money to become an affiliate of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, digitalinclusion.org, and get on our listserv. And a lot of the kind of how do you find people questions that people have raised are really the kind of stuff people solve for each other on that listserv. If I can, I just want to talk about two actual policy things that may come up in Stimulus 4, if that thing actually comes to the floor, that may speak to a number of the problems we've been talking about. It's true that large policy can't solve it all, but it could sure help. One large policy that a number of organizations have been trying to build support for is to get out of the realm of patchworks of charitable solutions being offered by utilities and simply create a national consistent subsidy for low-income folks for broadband service like LIHEAP for energy or SNAP for food. And there's a school of thought that says that should become a part of the Universal Service Fund Lifeline program. There's a school of thought that says don't go anywhere near Lifeline, do it in some other way. But there's, I think, beginning to be a significant discussion that includes some of the carriers about the possibility of simply having a consistent low-income subsidy program. And I think that's going to come up in those discussions. The other thing that's going to come up is an existing piece of legislation called the Digital Equity Act, which Senator Patty Murray introduced a year ago, which is essentially support for local digital inclusion programs processed in part through a state planning process. So it's a way of engaging a lot of decision makers at different levels of state and local government in having an actual policy of support for local digital inclusion programs with money attached. So I think those two things are both things that have significant legs. And then there are a number of organizations I could, the Free Press and, for example, Public Knowledge, National Consumer Law Center. I'm just listing folks randomly who've been very much involved in trying to find solutions for these things at the national level. And the National Library, the big National Library organizations, ALA and the Urban Library Council and a variety of others have also been major leaders in this stuff. So, and school organizations. So I don't think you're going to have a very hard time finding policy people at the top of your profession who are worrying about this policy stuff right now. The question is, can you find them and can you get engaged with them, and what does it have to do with your community? But I encourage you to find out, because now is probably the time.
Thank you, Bill. I've got one last comment here that I'd like to have you folks comment on to close us out. Steve Peters, if you're there still, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you about a recent FCC change that I think might have implications for a lot of us. Steve, are you there?
Yeah, I am still here. And just FYI, there are lots and lots of things that are happening at the federal level. There's a number of changes that have taken place and funding that's coming down the pike. And so we've created here in Arizona, we created a COVID-19 broadband, digital access task force to address, as many of you have talked about, that it's not just broadband connectivity, but it's also the access to other tools and technologies, as well as the ability to use that technology. But we really wanted to get focused on, we've been talking about the broadband connection issues for a long time, and actually have a lot of stuff, which I won't take the time to go into today, happening here in Arizona, very exciting kinds of things. But we said we needed to address some of the immediate things. And so one of the things we started to do was to look at what kinds of things are happening at the federal level, what kinds of monies are in the stimulus packages, and what kinds of decisions are being made by the FCC. And there have been a number of organizations that have lobbied the FCC. So one of the changes, and again, to not take a lot of time today, but one of the changes that you should also look into, for those of you who are familiar with E-rate funds, that any school or library that received E-rate funds previously had not been allowed to use those connections to serve homes and communities. Because of the current situation, excuse me, because of the current situation, the FCC has now changed those rules that now allows schools and libraries to serve communities. So they can now open those networks and provide Wi-Fi. That's the good news. The bad news, it's also a very challenging opportunity for people because, actually, let me turn my video on if that's okay. Okay, I guess I can't. Anyway, it opens a lot of challenges for the schools about how are they going to do that, what kinds of security issues and so forth, but it also provides some great opportunities. So I would certainly encourage you all to both look at the schools and also libraries. And the libraries, even though in most places the libraries are closed now, but if they have broadband access, they can now provide those services out in the community. So it's, like I said, I think you need to be looking at all of the federal kinds of things that are now happening. We started
Absolutely.
cataloging all of that on our website.
And Steve, I think that as I'm kind of looking at the back channel that Alyssa and Veronica are kind of working through what page or document on the STEM ecosystem site might look like that has not only all these resources that we're talked about today, but also kind of some of the step-by-step plans. Vint, we're at the end of our time. Close us out. Give us a rallying cry. Where do we go? Where do we go from here?
Look, any crisis should never be wasted, and we have a big crisis in front of us called COVID-19. Let's take advantage of it, first of all, to reinforce the importance of access to internet, broadband resources, and all the other things we spent the last hour talking about. But also, let's push forward and argue that we need those things after this crisis is over as well. And this is an infrastructure play. It's one that we should have done a long time ago. Now is the time to do it.
Thank you, Vint, Bill, Lynn, David, Samantha. I think that's a really incredible point. We have an opportunity now. We need to be thinking about it as an opportunity. How do we address this problem? But more importantly, how do we use the lessons from this situation to improve communities, economies, and schools beyond just this little window of time that we're talking about? This has been STEM Community Conversations from STEM at Home, brought to you by the STEM Learning Ecosystems Community of Practice. Thank you for joining us today for Connecting the Unconnected, Strategies for Ecosystems, brought to you by Spark 101. Thank you to our sponsor, Spark 101. Thank you to our incredible experts, Vint Cerf, Samantha Schartman-Cycyk, David Bray, Dr. Lin Wells, and Bill Callahan. These community conversations will revolve around successful models and new ideas to support STEM learning experiences during and beyond this time of social distancing. Stay tuned to stemecosystems.org for upcoming shows, and please continue to participate. I'm Jeremy Shorr. We'll see you next time.